There are two things that I'd like to explore in this video, and it relates to the probability field around domestic abuse, around personal abuse, around violence, but particularly in a couple relationship. And so this breaks down into two subcategories. One is when to tend the probability field, and the other is when to tend free choice. Now, to understand probability fields, Philip here is a variable. And as a result of Philip being here, Philip is my dog, so you can say hello, Philip. As a result of being here, I am going to be 30% more distracted. Now, what does that mean? That means that if I make 100 hours of video and compare the footage, that either 30 of the videos are going to be quite distracted and the others will be okay, or that in all of the videos there's going to be pauses, bits where I have to remember what I was saying, and as a result, Philip is a variable in this interaction that increases distraction. Now, with increased distraction comes increased frustration on both of our parts. So in this sense, Philip is a negative variable. If Philip is present, there's going to be 30% more, broken sentences, etc., and distraction. Now, on the flip side, we're talking about abusive situations, some of which I've experienced, and oxytocin, the presence of a dog, affection, etc., is going to possibly, particularly if you have a dog, lessen, not only the distraction, but lessen the degree of stress, because the mind is saying, oh, isn't that nice? There's a dog, and if you get overwhelmed, you can turn your attention to the dog, as can I, versus being stuck in the topic. Now, Philip has decided to start licking me. He doesn't always do this. In fact, most of the time when I want him to lick me because I'm ready for affection, he doesn't. Now he's decided to stand up. So the conversation begins to tip towards a negative because this is a sensitive topic. And, every time he thinks that my hand gestures relate to him, licks my hand, etc. And so the flip side is, if he's here as opposed to running up and down and, joining me later, and having to go upstairs and tie him up so he doesn't come up and down. So there's a cost to navigating from the probability where Philip does whatever he wants, and I'm going to put him on the floor, and the probability where he's, doing something stable. So this is a variable. Now, the best way to understand probability fields is as an influence, because let's say that I am 100% focused on you, and there's no space for Philip in my mind as a result. Well, this is this is relying on willpower. So you have these two forces. You have the will, which is pushing against reality, and then you have the reality, which is producing a probability field. Now, the reality that's producing the probability field, if we're dealing with water, the probability field is 100%, meaning water will flow the easiest way it possibly can flow downhill. And there's a part of human beings that is the same way. It will flow as rapidly as possible towards the probability field, meaning if I don't fight it, I will instantly get more distracted and thus impatient and irritable with Philip. So we don't even consider the absurdity of giving water a rapid downhill slope and then telling water to go uphill and go over this gentler slope because that's the moral thing to do. It just would not occur to be that inane. Because water has integrity. And by water having integrity, I mean it has an integrated pattern. There has never been a time in the history of water on Earth where water ran uphill when given an easier downhill alternative. That's the nature of water. So every person in relationship has a nature, and every environment is a hill. Now, given no interference with human will, everyone will go downhill, following their nature on the path of least resistance. However, unlike water, we have a consciousness, and with that consciousness, the ability to interrupt the downward slide and introduce this element of will that can take us upslope rather than downslope. So one of the questions then is, when do you focus on shaping nature to create an easier hill? And just as an aside, I've just tied Philip up, and, well, I haven't tied up Philip. I pressed pause, because that's part of the thing, realizing, oh, I have the ability on this camera to press pause, as opposed to stop and start again. 2, I knew my wife was editing a video on with her headphones, and so I wasn't sure if she'd hear, and I didn't want to break my train of thought. As it turns out, she heard, and so she is tying Philip up, and Philip went up, and so but then there was also the question of asking my wife to do me a favor. Well, we've had a little prickliness in the last 24 hours, and so, there's some part of me that doesn't want to ask her to do anything. And so, that's why, there's many situations in life where, it's perfectly obvious. There isn't a single doubt in my mind that Philip would interrupt the video. It's more, do I want to ask my wife? Do I want to lose my train of thought, etc.? Which is worse, kind of thing. And this, sometimes we need a little experience and self-awareness to figure out. And then, of course, it's how is Philip actually going to behave today? Because he could have just gotten in my lap, not licked me, and been a peaceful, nurturing presence, because he has that in his possibility field. It's not terribly probable, but about 20% of the time he would have done that. And then, since he went upstairs, what's the probability that there's plenty of videos I finish where he doesn't come down. And so what I'm getting at is, in the area of probability fields and trying to assess them, this is probably the most difficult and complex area of human decision-making. When you've got pros and cons of the one decision and pros and cons of the other. And And then we have a few other things, meaning I just ate a raspberry cookie with gluten, and so I'm going to be 20% more stuffy than if I hadn't eaten that raspberry cookie. Now that's going to mean I touch my nose at times where my nose itches, and that's going to trigger the thought in this culture, which is that people think that is less professional. Even this, in a culture that's very masculine and about getting to the point, this is taking a circuitous route. It's a feminine process. So either you're enjoying getting to know me, less likely in a masculine culture, or you're saying, come on, this is taking too long. Let's get to the point. Masculine is about the point. It's not about the journey, it's about getting there. And so in the United States, we're one of the most masculine cultures around, which on its flip side then means it's all the more medicinal to meander around. But in an addictive culture of adrenaline hits, points and solid focuses and stuff is much more satisfying to our limited attention span. So the statistical odds of you being more impatient are higher, particularly as a Western American. And they go up higher still if we look at subgroups, because we have a whole segment of the population that doesn't sleep very well, for example, and that has uncomfortable feelings, just, sitting somewhere in their stomach, and I don't quite want to just be present to those feelings. Well, the media that's chosen to answer this particular conundrum of emotional illiteracy, trauma illiteracy, coping management with sleep and addictive media and dopamine addictions and stuff like that, is you want someone to grab your attention so that you can forget about all this uncomfortable things, including forgetting that you're an addict. And so, get to the point, I want my dopamine hit. And so, there's that. And so, there are things that elevate and lower the probability field in any interaction. And so, if my wife is going to talk to me like this and add in some pauses and non sequiturs and things like that, and I'm in one of my dopamine, rushes, etc., I'm going to get increasingly hostile because she's not giving me my drug. And so this is, what I want to do here is talk about some of these metrics that affect the probability field of escalating violence. Now, when I say violence, let's look at violation. To fail to attune is the essence of violation. Because if I'm enjoying my hand here and I consider this my space, something we do in the West, so I say this is my space and my hand is in what I've decided is my space. And not only have I decided it, but hundreds of thousands of people have all modeled in Western culture, this is my space, don't touch people in their space. So here I am in my little self-defined, self-referencing cocoon, and somebody touches me. Well, then that's a violation of what? My concept of my space. And you just did that. In fact, my wife made me a beautiful card and a beautiful bouquet of wild-picked flowers today, which was absolutely lovely. But I found them in my office. And in my world and in our relationship, as in most relationships before, I found it helpful to have a sanctuary, one space in the house that no one enters without my permission. So that's a clearly established routine, and so I've told her a place in the living room that I'd love her to leave any surprise gifts, any cards, or please put them here. And when I've done my routine or whatever, if I'm ready, I will notice them, and I'll open them there when when I'm ready to receive that gift. And so the bouquet and the card is sitting on my office desk. Doesn't cause any problem, but it is a violation of the concept of a sanctuary. And it is a violation of what I requested. And it is a violation of the other request to put things here. And so in the same way that I've violated my body's gluten intolerance because there was a particularly, there's this wonderful powdered sugar raspberry shortbread that was fresh baked at the bakery. And it just seemed that the pleasure of eating that with a fresh espresso and fresh squeezed orange juice would be so wonderful that it would overcome this 20%, stuffiness. However, there are other factors, like the one that I've just gotten up. So I'm in the first 40 minutes of wakefulness, like the fact that sleep was a little bit strained, and so the immune system is a little lower, and that I forgot to take my vitamin D3 yesterday. And so, these are all variables. Now, that means my face is a little bit more pasty, which means that when I feel these little, my dog's hairs, these tiny little hairs, and he's been cuddling with me in bed, and so it's so irritating. It's like, here's one. It's like, it's so thin, and they just float around sometimes. They're so light. And so you can begin to see a 40% probability field of higher levels of irritation, certainly for me, and then the sugar content is a little high, and so there's a very slight arthritic pull here. Sugar is not the best thing for arthritis. Now, it only hits me if I have about 3 meals in a row with higher concentrations of sugar. So I violated the sugar continuum, the gluten continuum, the dog continuum, the vitamin continuum, the sleep continuum. So I violated optimal practices in all of these areas, and I'm creating an escalating probability field of failure. To what? To be relaxed, comfortable, get to the point. And what I want to suggest is that each of these are influences. They're like a headwind. If you walk outside and there's absolutely no wind, it doesn't take much energy to walk. But if the wind picks up and blows 20 miles against you, you have to walk harder to go against the wind. Now, why is this all relevant to the whole concept of emotional abuse and kind of domestic conflict? Because in the long run, the probability field always wins. Meaning in the long run, no matter how much I will and concentrate and say, body, digest that cookie, don't give me arthritis, I just want to eat sugar, and nose, stop being stuffed up. I'm going to stuff you up with gluten, but don't do it. Don't get stuffed up. That kind of dynamic. The probability field is like the house. In Vegas, the house always wins. You place 100 bets in Vegas, and 98% of the time you're going to walk away with less money than you arrived with 100 bets. Because the odds are stacked against you. So you can see this is the way the past interacts with the present and the future. There's a momentum. It's like I ate the cookie in the past, but it's going to affect me for the next 6 hours. I didn't take the vitamin D3 in the past, and it will affect me until I do take it. And here we see the dynamic of consciousness, because since I've talked about it twice, and since it's a quick step away, I'm now going to interrupt that momentum, press pause on the camera, and take a vitamin D3 and a bit of water. And this is going to move my body and stuff like that. And so we're going to do that. So we're back with a little water and 2 vitamin D3s and a little bit of movement. Let's get settled again. The probability field is the most powerful thing that we can attend to. The use of will, as in I'm going to make this work, is inappropriately applied to something like going to Vegas and placing 100 bets. You're going to lose. It's a waste of will. The purpose of will is to increase the probability field, as in pause, water, and vitamin D3. The purpose of will is to remember no more sugar for the rest of the day. That's a willed choice, and that will change the probability field for tomorrow. So let's look at some of the probability fields for healthy relationship versus relationships that are deteriorating. And I want you to, we're going to go over, a good 8 to 12 variables. And each one has a 1 to 10 scale, meaning they're on a gray scale. It's not just, it's not like I've been pouring sugar down my throat. I ate one raspberry cookie. But the raspberry cookie with the orange juice, and with the last meal being a baguette and nectarine. It was this beautiful organic nectarine with a goat brie, so baguette, fresh baguette, baked in the oven, slathered in butter, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it was also a lot of sugar, white bread, nectarine jam on the one, strawberry jam on the other, cheese. So it's an environment conducive to a lot of acidity in the body, and then waking up, coffee and raspberry cookie. So of course there's some fun. The probability of this being fun as a spontaneous process is pretty high. The probability of it, creating too much sugar and depressing the immune system is also, 80-90% likely. So let's go through these things, and I want you to see these as your betting average. So every day you're in a relationship, and it's a bet. if you're in relationship, you're betting that by the end of the day, all things considered, that you're going to be better off than if you end the relationship or take space out of the relationship. And some of this is logistically driven, of course, because, like Philip, I can't just magically think and he disappears. I have to pause, remove him, see what he does, then call my girlfriend, my wife, and tell her what to do. And then it's handled. So it's not like you can just snap your fingers and your spouse or your lover just vanishes that day. There's consequences for that. If you just say vanish and don't explain anything, they may never come back. And then you have to look at the fallout of that. And so it's a ripple effect. Okay. So over here on this 1 to 10 scale, we're looking at dependency. So, how dependent is your partner on you? Or how dependent are you on your partner? When we're looking at two things here. The first is the level of dependency in the relationship. Meaning if you have two people that cannot survive psychologically, financially, sexually, or otherwise, without the other, you've got high dependency. Now, this is a very, very big metric that we're dealing with. And it's got a number of subcategories. And each of these determine the level of dependence. So, let's take financial dependence. So I live in Marin County, where the average home is $1.2 million. The average low-end rent, it's not the average, it's the low-end rent, is $2,500. Now, let's compare this with my apartment in Thailand, where I have two apartments, and they're each $130 a month. So, So anyway, we've got 130. So as you can see, the number of careers that you can run and be able to pay $130 a month in rent versus, $4,000 a month for, this house is very different. You can be an artist and fiddle around and probably make $130 a month in Thailand. And your art isn't going to sell for a lot more or a lot less, whether you're in Thailand or not. It's going to be very tough when just the house costs $4,000 a month. That means you have to sell $4,000 of art a month just to break even. And then what about food? And then what about a car? And what about sales and marketing costs? So can you, as an artist, sell $10,000, $20,000 of art a month and then deduct various expenses and live here? Well, if you're an artist and you're in a relationship with someone who's a contractor, contracting generally does quite well. Now you've got an imbalance in finances. Now, what does that mean? It means that your living capacity may be 300% higher if you're in a relationship with a contractor than in a relationship with another artist. Or, if two artists get together, etc., they may not be able to relate, they may not be able to afford rent. And that's what we're looking at in homelessness, which is an abusive dynamic in my county. Meaning there's 1,500 homeless people because they cannot afford rent. Well, if you have the choice between being homeless and being in a relationship that violates several things, like you don't like the way someone assumes that you're always going to listen to them for 3 hours. Well, that's a violation of attuning around conversation. And so on this dependency, metric, finances is one of the areas of dependency or or independence. If you have one partner who's going to experience a substantial and perhaps trauma-inducing drop in living if the relationship ends, and the other partner is not, statistically, the person who's going to experience the drop is going to violate their own boundaries and needs much more often to accommodate and avoid violating the preferences and needs of the other, so that the relationship will not end, so that they will not go through the uncertainty of where am I going to live, etc. Now, this is not a good scenario. If you want to improve your odds of having low abuse in a relationship, you want both people to be able to sustain a similar or higher quality of life apart, so that being together is a ritual of preference and respect versus a ritual of desperation and need. Now, here again, you can spend all kinds of willpower saying, I will respect myself. I will respect myself. Or you can respect yourself enough to learn about money and learn about a career that makes money and that still is satisfying. And then you don't have to do that mantra because it would never occur to you not to engage with someone you wanted to based on money, or not to take space or end with someone because of money. So this is on a financial metrics. And so if you've got an imbalance in finances, and particularly a dependency, you will increase the odds of the relationship being healthy and less abusive. If part of the agreement, because every relationship has a love affair, I love you, I adore you, I admire you, I think you're beautiful, I like being close to you, I feel joy in your presence. This is the love affair. But every relationship also has a contract. The contract is the template of acceptable and unacceptable behavior. A beer or two is okay. Coming home incoherent in a drunken stupor and wanting to fuck me without any foreplay, no. That's not the deal here. Or, sure, that sounds fun. So what's the agreement? I will pay for everything just because for indefinite future, I'm just going to always pay for everything. Or, no. You need to be growing steadily in your finances with a goal and a commitment to moving towards balance in the relationship, and definitely towards independence, so that you could end this relationship at any time and not experience trauma, so that you can afford to be more honest, so that our relationship can grow with the fruits that come with that honesty. You see, because one of the reasons that relationships that have an asymmetrical ratio of dependence-independence are more likely to lead towards violence, is that they're predisposed to violation. Now, every single time you say, God, that pisses me off, and then you think, they're not going to change that. They're going to give me the choice to leave. This is their house. And the only reason it's pissing me off is I would like to, have them change. I'd like them to live the way I want them to live. But this isn't the kind of person who's going to do that. This is the kind of person that's going to say, well, if you don't like the art I've hung in my house, if you don't like the music I play in my house, then you should go to your own house and have some space and do some of that. Because I'm not going to redecorate the house. I'm not going to do this. Sure, I'll enjoy giving you this, and I'd love to see your style of art and all that. But no, I'm not going to do all of that. You see, and then this puts this bind within the other person where they don't speak what they're feeling because they don't want to take responsibility for the consequence, the responsibility to create a space of their own in which they can have all the interesting art and actually contribute that to the relationship. Because if you have two houses or two apartments or whatever it is, and one has a beautiful style that's completely their own, and you get to see them in their space, and then you come over and they see you in your space, and you go over into there and they see you in their space, and you see you in your space. It's an increase in range. You get to see different personas emerge. And so by not having their own space, and by not owning and developing the skills and talents to create that, it weakens the probability field in the relationship on that level of dependence, which then correlates with honesty, which then correlates with violation. Because then your partner's going to say, how are you feeling? And they're going to say, I'm fine, as opposed to, I just can't stand your art. Because I don't want to see where that conversation would go, i.e., okay, well, what would you like to do about that, since this is my art, So this is a very important metric. If you have one person that is completely independent and the other person that is high dependency, then you're going to have a situation where one person doesn't violate themselves, and the gift of that is that they're not going to build up pent-up energy. Now, I'm using money because it's an easy one, but the same thing is true emotionally. If you have one person who hates themselves, for example, then they're not going to want to be alone because they're being alone with an abuser who hates them. Who wants that? No one. So if a person hates themselves and someone else loves them, the part in them that feels hated can't wait to get away from themselves and over to the other person who loves them, because they want to be loved rather than hated. But if the only way to be loved is to be away from oneself and in the other person's space who has more love for them than they have for themselves, now you have a panic situation. Because, you've had a nice 6-hour visit, 4-hour visit, and it's time to have some space. But the person who's enjoyed being loved all day says, wait a minute, as soon as I get home, I'm going to be alone with my critic. My critic is going to analyze everything I did, is going to tell me how stupid I am. I don't want to leave. I don't want to go home and face that critic. So, what's the choice? Well, prostitution is one of the choices. So the part that doesn't want to go home to face the abuser inside now may want to go towards pleasing the other person through a series of self-violations to avoid the bigger violation of being abused alone at home. So what does that look like? Well, they don't really want to have sex that day. They don't really want to talk about computer chips. They don't really want to listen to a horror movie. But the fear of being home alone is so high you see, this is also, an interesting dynamic here, right? Because I don't need your money. I don't need to hear what you have to say. There's not particularly something that I'm expecting to get from this, other than clarifying my own thoughts in a way that I find useful in my relationships, one, and two, the pleasure of knowing that there will be a certain number of people, a certain number of times over the next 20 years, that improve their relationships a certain amount because I did this, and that makes me happy, because I think relationships are important, and I want to live in a world where people have healthier relationships. And I'm irritable, as I mentioned with the stuff. So, I don't want to deal with pausing the video and stuff. And so I can blow my nose and deal with the fact that there will be a certain amount of pushback in a certain number of people about that. And I want to live in a world where people can blow their nose and be accepted as human beings, and you can do the same. And so I can take risks in that way that I couldn't do if this was a taped program with people investing hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the sponsors would pull out if I wasn't being professional, and professional did not include blowing your nose and you have to do this. I can do this. I can be myself because I'm in that situation. Because there's an independence in the relationship. And you can probably deal with it a little bit more than you could if there were an independent, an interdependence. Meaning, if I've watched women around me, if they're really into me and want to get married or something, they start becoming more controlling because they need me to look a certain way. But I'm not interested in looking at that certain way. So this is a really big factor. The independence emotionally, the independence mentally, the independence sexually. You see, this is another thing, and it's more so typically with men. But if you can go out and get laid, with 5 different women on any given night, and your partner is tired and doesn't want to have sex, it's not a big deal. You can support that. Please take care of yourself. Please do what's best for you. I can take care of myself. Now, in a monogamous relationship, I have a monogamous relationship with my wife, there's still an awareness, there's a context around dependence and independence that says, okay, I'm having a monogamous relationship because I want that. Why? Because I want my wife to feel special. Because I want the deeper emotional intimacy that comes when she's not wondering, did I like it better with someone else that day or something? And so I like that. And I also, she gives that happily. That's her nature in return. And she likes having sex. There's never been a time when I said, gee, I'd love to have sex, how about it? Where her body hasn't enjoyed that, and so it's not, it doesn't feel like a scarcity. It's more creating a sacred container around it, where we have something, unique and special together. So it's an additive value, and it doesn't come, at least on my side, from a place of scarcity. It comes from an awareness that I've spent time with a good 100 women over the years, and I know that sex is not the be-all and end-all. How do I know that? Because, the best lover of my entire life, where we had sex literally 2 to 4 times, sometimes 5 times every single day for months on end, and always enjoyed it immensely and constantly. That was not enough for me to choose to be married. It was the best sex of my life, incredibly satisfying. And, referencing that dynamic of, as we were getting closer in that direction, she'd probably have objected to this. Men shouldn't wear effeminate things, or, could you, your hair's sticking up, or, whatever it is that I don't usually pay that much attention to. And I really got how important it was to her that I be normal. And I looked at how hard I'd worked to be intelligently anomalous, meaning to diverge consciously from the status quo in areas I was impatient or irritated by the status quo. And that wasn't a plus for her. These were all negatives, because they might make her look unusual. And this was a higher priority than thinking and creating, etc. And so there's a choice then. The best sex of your life, or someone that supports you in being the best you that you want to be. Well, I wouldn't trade my wife for that life. So, I'm quite happy to, accept this, the container and that very, very beautiful third. When you have a solid and beautiful container, there's a third energy that gets born in the relationship. It's incredibly beautiful. It's incredibly sacred, meaning it's something that is potent and dynamic enough it's worth making sacrifices for. And with all her gifts and faults, my wife supports me in giving birth to that third energy, and I support her in giving birth to that third energy. And that third energy in any relationship has the capacity and the probability of being greater than either person's energy alone. That third energy is bigger than either person alone. It's the energy of the sacred child, which can be ritually enacted in having a child, which we don't, but it is there as an energy field to be tended and honored as a sacred thing. Now, this gets back to the question of violence and violation. As we can see, the more a relationship has asymmetrical dependence, or mutual dependence. Now, what do I mean by that? So I think the most likely to be abused relationship is when you couldn't survive financially without your partner and they couldn't survive financially with you. So neither one of you can afford to speak to anything that would threaten the relationship. Because of that independence, there's only one space, and it isn't a big enough space to allow both of you to express and grow yourselves. So there's a constant sense of violating and crossing boundaries there. You're both terrified of being alone because you abuse yourselves and you treat the other a little better than you treat yourself. So anytime you're alone with your own abuser. So you desperately cling to the other even when you're not enjoying yourself, because to go home alone is to be alone with your abuser. Now, this is an internalized abuser. It means you were abused as a child and in the culture, and you agreed to abuse yourself to fit in. Nobody is born abusing themselves. So you need each other emotionally. You have no other options sexually, and so you're terrified of feeling like a loser or whatever if you can't, and so you can't speak the truth, meaning there's certain things that are going to turn your partner off, but you can't talk about those because then they won't have sex with you for a week to punish you, right? Or this and that, the other, and then you feel helpless that whole time. It's like, I hate, and then you build up tension. And the other person can't get you to, treat them sexually the way they want, and they're not going to give it to you, and you're not going to give it to them. So we're looking at a situation that is going to build up energy that is, in an emotionally and relationally illiterate culture, almost certainly going to erupt in violence, in abuse. It is abuse. I mean, you are in a completely abusive paradigm here. You're abusing yourself, you're abusing your partner, they're abusing themselves, and they're abusing you. It's a complete loop of abuse. Now, when I talk about abuse, I'm not talking about evil. I'm talking about poor use. It's like if you put diesel into a gasoline engine, it's not going to go. It's abuse. It's not using it well. The car is ruined until you get it out and fix the engine and stuff. That's abuse. When you put, dependency, lies, and hostility into your partner and they can't function, that's abuse. When you do something that brings out the best in yourself and your partner, that's well use. So, just to be clear, the more you abuse someone and yourself, the more pain you're going to be in. The more pain you're going to be in, the more you need to distract yourself with pain. The more you're distracting yourself with pain as opposed to growing and healing, the less likely you are to attune to your partner and yourself. The more likely you are to act out violently to deflect the pain. When the pain builds up to a certain point where you can't deal with it as a conscious mind, you act it out by either putting it into your body, and now the emotional pain is now in your body as a somatic pain. So now you can't walk, now you have a back spasm because you couldn't deal with that level of terror, of panic, etc. that the relationship brought up. So you put it in your back, now your back can't move. So you just migrated the energy over from an emotional, mental dimension into a physiological dimension, because that's safer to do in America. Why? Because we don't talk about emotions, but we can go on about our physiological symptoms for hours. You get two elderly people in America together, and they can discuss all the bits of their body they've replaced, and this and that, and this and that and the other, and they're in heaven. You take that all into emotional terrain and talk about the terror of the 4-year-old child with the father, the bit that hates the 4-year-old for being small, the angry, independent, rebellious part, but then the part that's afraid that the rebellious part is going to be seen, and then the part that's feels despise, disgust at the self for all those lies, and you won't tell the truth, and I'm better than you, and then disgust the partner for believing this part. And, you could talk about that for hours as well. It just requires a little bit of emotional literacy, and it's completely taboo in a chauvinistic culture that's all about material expression of all these things and denial of the inner framework from which they emerge. We're still dealing with this metric. 1 to 10, how independent are you emotionally, sexually, mentally, financially, logistically? Meaning if you're in a wheelchair or you can only move one arm and you're in a cast, you're not in an independent state. If your partner decides to leave you at that moment, you could die, or at least feel terrible shame and humiliation or trauma or fear of death, etc. And so, there's a range of dependence. Now, here again, this is not an area of will, meaning you can't just say, I want to have money so that I'm independent financially. You have to say, I want to have money so I'm independent financially, so I'm going to carve out 1 hour a day to improve my financial future. And then I'm going to figure out what's the best way to do that, which books to read, which, products to create, which services to study, which jobs to apply for, etc. And then, within 2 years at an hour a day or 6 months at 3 to 4 hours a day, I will be able to boost this up. And I can't just say that. I've actually got to write out a set of goals. I've got to write out an action plan around those set of goals. And then I've actually got to look at those goals every day and check them off one by one, and then deal with the fact that I got in a car accident and I've got to, catch up and then, do this and that. And then there we are. So it's will leading to a structure, leading to a discipline, leading to an action that then leads to changing the reality. And then the reality changes the psychology. Meaning when you look at your bank account and say, I've got 100 grand there, and I can be anywhere I want to be, and I can be with anyone I want to be, and it doesn't have to be around money, how do I feel? You will answer the question differently, how do you feel? Then when you say, I'm $30,000 in debt, I'm never going to be able to pay this off without my partner. I'm uncertain about my job, and, I sure hope they don't have an affair, because if they do have an affair, I'm not sure I have the guts to leave, and I don't know where I'd go if I did. And God, I resent them for doing this to me, as opposed to, how did you get into debt? Well, what are you going to do about that? You're going to tear up your credit cards. What are you going to do? You see, it's 10 to 100 things that you have to do to change that reality. You change the reality, now you feel very differently. How do you feel? I feel resentment. I feel great. I feel empowered. I feel confident. Or the dependency is emotional. I feel so afraid of being alone with my own internalized abuser. I feel so terrible about who I am. I feel so much sorrow about the death of my brother and feeling it was somehow my fault that I don't want to be alone at all costs. Here, you scumbag, you'll take 100 grand as long as you steal my money and stick with me. Just don't leave me. So it's not a financial dependency at all. It's an emotional dependency. And so here we have, the typical gold-digging abuse contract, where you tell me the lies that I want to hear. You don't bring up the shadow aspects that I don't want to see. You be enough of a prostitute pleaser in order to satisfy me. And you can do whatever you want with my money. Well, if you have that dynamic, and just pause a moment. Because there's a lot of sadness in our culture around this. There's a lot of grief. The loneliness, the hurt, the wanting to be loved by someone more than we know how to love ourselves is such that many will walk away from a fortune for two reasons. One, they don't feel like they deserve it, because I'm not lovable, right? Because I'm not loving myself. And I'm not loving myself because that's the internalized abuser, because I wasn't loved, and I wasn't loved because I'm not lovable. That's the psychology build up to that. And so I don't really deserve all this money, and I will happily give it away so that I don't feel guilty, and so that you won't leave me until you've run out of money, until you hate yourself for running out of someone else's money, until you hate me because you're dependent on me financially, and you want to, and you disrespect me because you know that I know that you're stealing my money and lying, and you know that I'm putting up with it because I need you, not because I love you, not because I love myself. This is a very difficult dynamic, because when we hate ourselves on some level, we hold a contract, we hold an energy field, which people try and feel solid. Everyone tries to know where they stand, and so they push, particularly people who've had very poor boundaries like myself in childhood. I begin a relationship by figuring out where the boundaries are, not what someone says, but if I push you in here, what do you do? If I push you here, what do you do? If I push you here, what do I do? And I get a sense of how someone actually feels about themselves from that process, number one, and also by their invitation boundary process. I've literally had women tell me, "Oh, I know I'm irritating. Feel free to hit me. I would too if I was you. I'm so irritating. Just don't leave me." And you get the sense that they'll take any abuse you want. Just don't leave me alone with my own abuse, because it's worse. Your abuse is nothing compared to the self-loathing and hatred that I have internalized from my original abuser, the parental social structure. And so here's the dynamic, though. You see, you could make a rational argument to say, okay, nobody really acts outside of their interest, so their internalized abuser is so bad that if you move into their life and just hit them and shout at them a few times, it'll be heaven compared to the self-loathing they're going to be directing to themselves through getting obese, through refusing to act, through refusing to grow, through numbing their emotions, hating themselves, the whole thing, the addictions and all that. So you could say their life will improve. And yet, you cannot do to someone else without reprogramming your own psychology. Now, it's very difficult It's very difficult to be with someone who loathes themselves and who invites you to loathe them at every turn and invites you to abuse them, but please don't leave me alone with my own abuser. It's very difficult to argue with someone in that state that they're valuable. Because the last time they were valuable, they went up against an overwhelming force, were crushed, and nearly died. What am I talking about? Children are violated all the time in this culture. We don't know how to attune to the energy fields, the emotions, the needs of children. The culture doesn't attune to it. The parents don't attune to it. The school doesn't attune to it. There is at least 60% of violation that is going on from the moment of birth. Now, some of this violation is just chronic, steady, consistent violation of, no, that's not how guys are. No, you're a girl, you shouldn't do this. It's a violation of the nature and probability field of a healthy human being to fit into this sick, lopsided view of a human being or a man or a girl, or, in this culture that is completely out of line with the real nature of that human being. It's a violation. And it feels painful, so then you need to numb, and all this stuff. But, 20% of that violation happens in a traumatic way, where, the child doesn't like that, and they want this, or they don't like this, or, they've been addicted to something, dopamine or whatever, so they start acting out their addiction, and it's making them sick. Well, when that's a framework that enables the parent to cope and survive in the culture, then we have a dynamic where the child expresses a boundary, a need, and then is met with violation, hatred, slap, being put in another room as, isolation, a variety of things that basically say, if you don't like the way things are going to go down here, I have the means to kill you. I'm a giant, you're an infant. I have all the power, you don't. Things are going to go my way, and the only question you have is to shut up and put out, or be punished. And you get that this is not moving anywhere. This is where the internalized abuse comes in. You realize I've got to abandon myself and my probability field and who I am and all this, and I've got to figure out what it takes to survive here. I feel hurt and terrified every time my mother shakes me like this and gives me to a stranger. But that never does any good. And the strangers are nicer than my mother. So I'm going to reprogram that into what? A smile, a silence? I'm going to go silence every time I'm angry. So now as an adult, someone hurts your child, and you find yourself going silent because you feel you're going to die if you speak out about it, because that never got dealt with and never got resolved. So the internalized abuser is the phenomena. The internalized abuser is the phenomena of an early childhood experience that the only way to survive without shock and continual trauma was to rewire the self to make the abuser feel comfortable doing whatever it was they felt they wanted and needed to do. Now, we have sexual abuse in our culture, we have physical abuse, We have abusive energies. When someone goes on a substance addiction, children are sensitive to energy and emotional fields. So a completely different persona comes out. They're not regulated. This is terrifying. And what many of our children do is they say to themselves, I'm going to do anything it takes to survive and make my abuser happy. They watch the faces of their abusers and they notice that every time they behave like this, the faces statistically are less violent or less intense. So they do that. And then the abuse stays at a level that they survived. And the child grows up on an unconscious level feeling absolute certain that they're going to die if they break that taboo and start actually telling the truth about how they feel. The truth will get them killed. Now, we see that on a large scale with someone like Julian Assange. Julian Assange, single-handedly with WikiLeaks, has done more to bring light to corrupt, illegal activities by the U.S. governments and by the U.S. government than any other news agency in the world. And how far has the boundary been pushed? There are more than 5 international laws being broken to punish Julian Assange at every single level. The amount of U.S. tax money, the amount of violation of human rights, of principles of journalism, the whole spiel is incredibly enormous. And the message is clear. You tell the truth about the power structure. So the U.S. is the patriarchal father. You tell the truth about the father, and you're dead. We will systematically make your life a living hell. Now, this is a very clear message in any abuse structure. And so most of us make peace with our abuser as a certain amount of prostitution. Most daughters, if they have a relationship with the father, have an incestuous relationship, emotionally, physically, financially, mentally, where it consists of, I know what upsets you, and I know what makes you feel good about yourself, Dad. And so I'm going to go out of my way to protect your stupidity, your ignorance, your abuse, by covering for you in group situations, by coaching the men I bring over on what not to talk about. Don't bring this up to my father. In other words, I'm going to protect my father the way he taught me to protect so that I feel love and belonging and that I can survive. And you, in order to fit into my life, have to learn to protect my father also. You have to sign the contract. Otherwise, you're going to be punished by my father, by my mother, and by me. Because my father's too dumb to know that he's dumb, and so he's going to punish you and pretend it's all your fault. And we know he's too dumb to know that he's dumb. We also know it's taboo to talk about that. And so we are going to punish you for not having the good grace to understand that he's too dumb to know that he's dumb and pretend that he's smart so that he can feel good about himself, so that he doesn't have to deal with his abuse, so that he doesn't have to apologize to us, which is beyond his emotional ability. So we are going to be abused. We're going to take care of our abuser. We're going to lie about the abuse. And we're going to punish anyone else who doesn't do the same thing. You want to join our family? No. So this is the incestuous abuse contract. Now, I worked very hard to find a woman who would put herself and our marriage ahead of her family. Now, I'm not saying, kill her family, hurt her family, etc. I'm saying that particularly in a traumatized culture, the need to protect the abusive relationship is so strong that if a woman puts her family ahead of the marriage, it typically means putting the abusive contract ahead of the marriage, which typically dooms the marriage to failure, because the marriage cannot grow and blossom unless both people put the archetypal energy, the third energy, that beautiful sacred energy that is born between the two people. They don't put that first and sacrifice that which gets in its way. Every single abuse contract gets in the way of that third energy. So if you don't want to saddle the child, the third energy, with the ancestral abuse contract, you've got to sever ties with the abuse contract. Now, in a chauvinistic, traumatized, emotionally illiterate culture such as our own, this almost always means severing ties with the abuser, who will refuse to engage outside of the abuse structure. Because to do so, you see, there's a ripple effect, there's a domino effect. The thing either goes forward or it goes backward, these abuse patterns. See, when you hold a stand and don't let the domino thing come forward, you're not letting the symmetry of the virus in your abuser continue to the next generation. Well, that is what completes the loop. You carrying their symptoms completes the loop. Now, you stand a line. Now, they can't complete the loop, which means the toxicity builds up in them to a point where they can't deal with it, which means they've got to start joining you and putting it backwards, or they've got to dissociate from you because they can't go back and confront their own abuser and give the pattern back, psychologically, energetically, emotionally, verbally, etc. They can't do that. And so they won't accept you not doing that. So they'd rather kill you. And this is a very important thing to be aware of. They'd rather kill you than tell the truth or hear your truth. Now, you can kill people in a lot of different ways. You can turn them into an addict and blame them for it. You can enable someone's addiction. You can drive them crazy. Anytime they get near the truth, you attack them. You can hook a child in financially and then shatter anytime they get near the truth, etc. Because it's a dark contract where you don't get to tell the truth or you get shocked. And I want you to be dependent and weakened so that you can't afford to tell the truth so that you'll get shocked. One of the paradoxes of independence is that you don't reach independence by dissociating and not having emotional needs, not having financial needs, not having money. but rather the opposite, that one reaches a state of independence by consciously creating abundance in each of the various dimensions. And it's not just an intention, it's hundreds of small actions, from books to investing in friendships to investing in financial skills that earn money, etc., etc. So this is the metric of dependence or versus independence. And the ideal on this metric of kind of reducing the probability of abuse, violation, etc., is to have both people have an abundance of money, an abundance of experience and opportunities around sex, an abundance of friendship, an abundance of time, an abundance of skill and healing work around trauma, etc., and yet to choose to prioritize the relationship. So this is the dependence continuum.